Welcome to Hard Script.
The room laughed before I even realized the sentence had landed. My wife, Vanessa, stood at the center of the living room with a glass of champagne raised slightly too high. Her friends gathered around her like a private audience. Music filled the background, soft enough for every word to travel. The party had been her idea, a celebration for the new production facility our company had just secured. I had spent the entire afternoon greeting investors and partners as they arrived, shaking hands, answering questions, making sure the night ran smoothly. Vanessa thrived in rooms like this. She moved from group to group with effortless confidence, introducing people, telling stories, keeping attention fixed exactly where she wanted it. I stepped toward her when the conversation opened, about to introduce her to one of our new suppliers who had flown in for the event. She didn't turn to face me fully. She tilted her head just enough for her voice to carry. She said I should know my place. The words came with a small laugh, as if they were playful, harmless, part of the performance. Her friends laughed instantly. A few guests exchanged quick glances before joining in. She waited. The pause stretched long enough that the room leaned toward it, expecting noise, expecting tension, expecting a reaction that would give them something to remember from the night. Across the room, my CFO, Mark Dalton, stood near the bar watching the exchange with a stillness that didn't match the laughter around him. He lifted his drink slightly, like he was acknowledging a private joke only he understood. Vanessa turned back to her friends, already moving the conversation forward as if nothing unusual had happened. The microphone for speeches rested on the dining table behind her, waiting for later in the evening. I picked it up before anyone realized the schedule had changed. The music lowered when the microphone clicked on. Conversations thinned out in waves. Glasses paused halfway to lips. Vanessa turned slowly, still smiling, expecting a playful comeback or a public show of irritation she could later smooth over with charm. I thanked everyone for coming. I mentioned the new facility, the investors who believed in our expansion, the team that had worked late nights to secure the contracts. My voice stayed level, measured, the same tone I used in boardrooms. The room relaxed. Vanessa's posture shifted back into confidence. She stepped closer, as if to stand beside me for the applause she assumed was coming. I continued. I said growth required alignment. I said alignment required transparency. I said that earlier in the week, our board had finalized a restructuring of the company's financial leadership to prepare for the next phase. There was a small ripple through the crowd, subtle but immediate. Mark stopped lifting his drink. I announced that effective immediately, financial oversight would transition to an external interim firm while the board completed a formal review of internal controls. I thanked Mark for his years of service and dedication during what I described as a period of transition. No accusations. No raised voice. Just language clean enough to echo. Vanessa's smile didn't drop at first. It froze. Mark's expression changed more quickly. He did not look surprised. He looked exposed. He set his glass down without finishing it. A few of the investors exchanged quiet words. One of the board members standing near the fireplace gave a short, confirming nod. I ended by saying the company would continue forward with clarity and strength. I thanked our partners again and placed the microphone back on the table. For a moment, no one moved. Vanessa stepped toward me, her hand gripping my arm tighter than necessary. She asked under her breath what I thought I was doing. I looked at her and said the board had made its decision last week. She blinked. That was the first thing she hadn't known. Mark left before dessert was served. He did not argue in front of the guests. He did not approach me again that night. He spoke briefly to one of the board members near the entryway, nodded once, then walked out with controlled composure. A few investors noticed. Most pretended not to. Vanessa stayed in the center of the room, shifting between groups, laughing a little louder than usual. She told one of her friends that corporate restructuring was normal at our level. She said transitions were strategic. She said I sometimes enjoyed dramatic timing. She did not look at me while she said it. When the last guests finally drifted out, the house felt larger than it had an hour earlier. Catering staff cleared glasses from the counters. Vanessa stood near the kitchen island, heels in hand, waiting for me to explain. She asked why I had blindsided Mark. She said he had been loyal for years. She said I could have handled it privately instead of turning it into a spectacle. I told her the decision had been finalized before the party was even scheduled. She stared at me for a long moment and then asked who else knew. I told her the board, our legal counsel, and the interim financial firm were already in place. Her jaw tightened slightly. She said Mark had assured her the company's numbers were solid. She said he had been staying late for weeks to finalize budget revisions for the expansion. She said I rarely came home before dinner anymore and might not understand how much work he had taken on. I watched her carefully when she said his name. The following morning, I met with the external auditors at our headquarters. They presented summaries of internal transfers, vendor overlaps, and expense approvals that had bypassed dual authorization. The pattern was consistent and deliberate. That afternoon, Vanessa texted me asking if I could reassure Mark that the review was procedural. I did not respond immediately. Instead, I forwarded another set of documents to the board's legal team and scheduled a formal executive session for the end of the week. The executive session did not include Mark. He was informed by legal counsel that his presence would not be required until the review concluded. The language was controlled and procedural, but the message was clear. That morning, I arrived at headquarters earlier than usual. The production floor was already active, machines running in steady rhythm. From the glass conference room above, the board members reviewed the auditor's findings without raising their voices. Unauthorized reallocations. Inflated consulting fees tied to a shell vendor. Travel reimbursements that overlapped with Vanessa's event schedules in cities where we had no corporate contracts. The external firm had mapped the transactions chronologically. Late budget approvals had turned into private strategy sessions. Strategy sessions had turned into overlapping itineraries. No one in the room mentioned Vanessa's name. When Mark was finally invited in, he carried himself with the same calm professionalism he had shown for years. He said the vendor relationships were exploratory investments. He said some expenses were miscategorized during rapid growth. He said the timing was coincidental. He did not deny the numbers. He requested time to clarify documentation. The board chair informed him that effective immediately, he was being placed on administrative leave pending formal review for breach of fiduciary duty and conflict of interest. Mark nodded once, slowly. He asked whether this decision had my support. I told him the company required accountability at every level. He held my gaze longer than necessary before standing and leaving the room. That evening, Vanessa was waiting in the living room when I returned home. She had already spoken to him. She said he claimed the audit was excessive and that I was overreacting to technicalities. She said I was jeopardizing the expansion over pride. I placed a folder on the coffee table in front of her. Inside were printed summaries of the vendor overlaps and travel records. She did not open it immediately. Instead, she asked whether this was about what she had said at the party. I looked at her and told her this had started long before that night. Vanessa opened the folder after I walked into the kitchen. I could hear the paper shift against the glass coffee table as she turned each page. She did not call out immediately. She moved slower with every document. Vendor names, expense codes, travel dates that overlapped with her production trips to Miami and Seattle, cities where our company had no operational footprint. When I returned to the living room, she was holding one page slightly tighter than the others. She said the dates proved nothing. She said event producers traveled constantly and that it was normal for Mark to coordinate budgets in person. She said I was connecting lines that did not belong together. I did not argue. Instead, I unlocked my phone and opened the building access logs for the company's furnished executive apartment downtown, the one reserved for visiting partners. The logs showed repeated entries under Mark's credentials during weekends when no partners were scheduled. I placed the phone beside the folder. She did not touch it. Her expression shifted from dismissal to calculation. She asked how long I had been reviewing this. She asked whether anyone else knew about the apartment logs. I told her the board had access to everything tied to corporate property. She stood up then, pacing slowly across the living room, heels still in her hand from the night before. She said Mark would never risk his career for something careless. She said he had too much to lose. I watched her carefully when she said that. The next morning, legal counsel finalized Mark's termination documents. The language referenced breach of corporate ethics, undisclosed conflicts, and misuse of company assets. It was clean, formal, and irreversible. That afternoon, Vanessa received a message from Mark. He told her he needed space until the investigation concluded publicly. He said association could complicate matters further. She stared at the screen longer than necessary. In the evening, she asked if I planned to fight for our marriage or simply let it collapse with the audit. I told her I had already stopped holding what did not want to be held. Mark's termination became official 2 days later. A formal notice was circulated internally citing ethical violations and conflict of interest. No details were shared beyond policy language. The board thanked him for past contributions and wished him well in future endeavors. His company email was deactivated before noon. By the afternoon, his name was removed from the leadership page on our website. Operations continued without disruption. Vanessa stayed home that day. She did not attend the planning session she had scheduled for an upcoming corporate gala. I found her sitting at the dining table, her laptop open but untouched. She said Mark claimed the board had overreached. She said he insisted the apartment usage was for confidential investor meetings. She said I had misinterpreted proximity for betrayal. I listened without interrupting. She asked whether I had ever considered that she felt invisible beside the company I built. She said at events, people spoke to me about contracts and expansion, while she was expected to smile and amplify. She said Mark saw her as a partner in vision. Her voice was steady, not emotional, almost rehearsed. I walked into my office and returned with a sealed envelope. I placed it in front of her without commentary. Inside was a formal notice of intent to file for divorce and initiate division of marital assets under the prenuptial agreement we had signed before the company scaled. The language was precise. The business remained solely under my ownership. The residential property would transfer to her. She did not open the envelope fully. She read enough. She asked if this was retaliation. I told her it was structure. That evening, I packed a single suitcase and moved into a furnished apartment near headquarters. I left the house keys on the kitchen counter beside the envelope. Vanessa did not stop me at the door. Later that night, my phone rang. She said I had destroyed everything. I told her I had only stopped carrying it alone. Life inside the company tightened, then stabilized. The interim financial firm completed its review and confirmed what the board had already seen. Vendor contracts were renegotiated. Internal controls were reinforced. Investors who had paused expansion talks resumed negotiations once they saw decisive leadership. No one mentioned Mark in meetings anymore. Vanessa, however, remained attached to his name in ways she could not hide. Mutual acquaintances stopped inviting her to joint industry gatherings. A major venue withdrew from one of her upcoming productions, citing reputational alignment concerns. Sponsors who had once responded to her calls within minutes now redirected her to assistance. One afternoon, she requested to meet at a neutral location. I agreed. She arrived composed, but different. The performance was gone. She said Mark had relocated to another state after failing to secure a comparable executive position. She said he blamed the board, the auditors, even me. She said he needed distance from the fallout. She paused before adding that he had stopped answering her calls altogether. I did not react. She told me she had misjudged the balance of power. She said she believed aligning with him would position her closer to the company's future leadership. She said she thought I would fight harder for her once she challenged me publicly at the party. She mentioned the phrase she had used that night and admitted she expected anger, not silence. I let her speak until there was nothing left to defend. She asked if the divorce filing was negotiable. I told her the documents were already in motion. When we stood to leave, she hesitated as if expecting me to soften, to reach for her arm, to offer some version of the past. Instead, I stepped back first. As I walked toward my car, I saw her reflection in the glass storefront behind me, standing alone on the sidewalk where attention no longer gathered automatically. For the first time, she was not directing the scene. She was waiting to see if I would. The divorce proceedings moved quietly. Our attorneys exchanged documents without hostility. Asset division followed the terms of the agreement we had signed years earlier when the company was still fragile and ambition was shared. The house transferred fully to Vanessa. The business remained entirely under my ownership. There were no public statements, no dramatic filings, no contested hearings. At headquarters, I appointed a new permanent CFO after a thorough search led by the interim firm. The announcement was met with steady approval from investors. Production schedules accelerated. A new contract with a national distributor was signed before the end of the quarter. Momentum replaced uncertainty. Vanessa's event calendar, however, thinned. She attempted to secure a large corporate gala through one of our longtime partners, but the request was redirected to another producer. A board member from her industry advised her privately to allow time for reputational reset. She called me one evening after receiving that message. She said she had underestimated how interconnected our worlds were. She said she believed her brand operated independently from mine. She said she never imagined that a shift in corporate leadership could ripple into her social capital. I listened. She asked if I had told anyone about the executive apartment or the audit findings beyond what was legally required. I told her the documentation spoke for itself. She went quiet for a moment and then asked if there was any version of this where we rebuilt privately, away from the industry and its memory. I told her I was focused on forward movement. Later that night, as I reviewed production metrics in my apartment near headquarters, I saw a notification that she had removed my last name from her public profiles. The next morning, I finalized the last signature on the divorce decree. When I walked out of the courthouse, there were no cameras, no crowd, no spectacle, just structure closing where performance once stood. Several weeks after the divorce was finalized, Vanessa hosted a smaller gathering at the house. The invitations were selective this time. Fewer investors, more personal acquaintances. The scale was different from the celebration where she had once told me to know my place. The tone was quieter, almost cautious. I learned about the event from a mutual contact who mentioned it in passing during a supplier meeting. He said the turnout looked modest compared to her previous productions. He said the room lacked its usual energy. I did not comment. Later that evening, Vanessa called. Her voice carried the background hum of conversation, but it was thinner than before. She said some of her guests had asked about the company's expansion and my absence. She said she tried to explain that the divorce was amicable and strategic, not scandalous. She paused before saying that a few of them seemed more interested in the audit than in her new projects. I remained silent long enough that she filled the space herself. She said she now understood the difference between influence borrowed and influence built. She said at the party months ago, when she told me to know my place, she had believed the room belonged to her. She admitted she had expected me to react publicly, to argue, to defend myself, so she could reposition the narrative. Instead, she said, my composure shifted the gravity of the room. She asked whether I had planned that moment. I told her I had planned the structure long before the microphone. She let out a slow breath and said she never expected the silence to be louder than anger. As the conversation faded, I could hear laughter behind her, but it sounded distant, detached from her voice. When we ended the call, I returned to reviewing the next quarter's projections. The company continued moving forward, and for the first time, her world was no longer aligned with mine. Months later, I attended an industry conference where our company was presenting a new manufacturing partnership. The venue was larger than the house where Vanessa had once staged her gatherings. Investors, suppliers, and media representatives filled the ballroom with calculated attention. When I stepped onto the stage to introduce the new partnership, the room quieted in a way that felt earned, not curated. After the presentation, I stepped off stage and moved through clusters of conversations. Several familiar faces approached with measured respect. Questions centered on expansion timelines, automation strategies, and distribution networks. No one asked about my personal life. Near the far end of the ballroom, I noticed Vanessa standing beside a small group of event planners. She was there as a contractor for one of the breakout sessions. Her posture was composed, professional, but no longer orbiting the center. Our eyes met briefly. She crossed the floor slowly and stopped at a comfortable distance. She said she had watched the presentation and that the company looked stronger than ever. She said she had learned to build projects without leaning on borrowed status. She said the past year had clarified more than she expected. I listened without interruption. She did not mention Mark. She did not mention the party. She did not mention the phrase that had once echoed through a crowded living room. Instead, she said she understood now that when she told me to know my place, she had misread it entirely. She admitted she thought authority came from commanding a room. She said she did not recognize that real authority came from holding it steady. I nodded once. There was no anger left to display and no apology required. When she extended her hand in a gesture that was almost formal, I shook it briefly. Then I stepped back into the current of conversation around me. This time, when I left the room, no one laughed, and no one needed to be told their place.